Name is Briscoe?
Yes. And my married name is Vance, V-A-N-C-E.
Okay. This is November 7th, 1984.
That's right, it is. Thank you.
And this is Joe Todd, an interview with Mrs. Audrey Vance, V-A-N-C-E. Mrs. Vance, where were you born?
I was born in Hancock County, Illinois.
May I ask your birthday?
Do I have to tell you? I'll let you guess, and then I'll tell you.
You look like you're about 21.
21, well, I always say I'm 17 going on 18. But I was born August the 24th, 1898. It makes me 86 years old.
I would have never guessed that.
Well, that's what they all say.
I was honestly guess about 75.
Well, I've lived that long, but I'm not that old. That's right.
You're as old as you feel.
That's right.
Who was your father?
My father was John Robert Briscoe.
How do you spell that last name?
B-R-I-S-C-O-E.
Okay. And your mother?
Was Anata Mickle, M-I-C-K-L-E.
Were they from Illinois?
Yes. No, my father was from Palmyra, Missouri. That's where he grew up. So he was about 15 years old, I guess.
How long did you live in Illinois?
Till I was about 8 years old.
And where did you move?
We moved, my mother's health was, she was supposed to have throat trouble. And my father bought 400 acres of land down in Polk, P-O-L-K, County, Arkansas. We moved there in the spring, and the entire family almost died of malaria and dysentery in the summer. And we moved to western Kansas. I lived there for a year, and then we moved to Oklahoma.
And what year did you move to Oklahoma?
In 1908.
1908?
Mm-hmm.
What part of Oklahoma?
Ponca City.
Ponca City. What was your reaction when you first saw Ponca City? What did the town look like?
It was a wide place in the road. It was just a little, very little country town.
Just how many streets did the town have?
Oh, it went from, I think it was, went down to South, what is now South Avenue. It was incorporated then. There were two men who, when they made the run, who had acreage. One of them was Hartman, the other was Lynch. And Hartman had an addition which was starting, well, the business district and north. And Lynch was, he made his addition was Lynchville, and it was south. I've forgotten where the break was, but I think it might have been central. And it went to South Avenue. But that part of town wasn't very well developed.
Were the buildings mainly frame, or were there brick buildings here?
Well, they were mostly frame.
Mostly frame. What were some of the businesses at that time?
Calkins had a store at the corner of First and Grand, and it's still standing there. It was a brick building.
What kind of store was it?
It was a general merchandise store.
How come your family moved to Ponca City from Kansas?
Well, I don't know that. I just came with them. I was, 8 years old, 9 years old.
How'd you travel?
Well, part of the family came by covered wagon, and part of it came by train.
Which part? How'd you travel?
By covered wagon.
Tell me about the trip.
Well, we left Deerfield, which is about 20 miles, I guess, west of Garden City, Kansas. And we came down through Dodge City to Dodge City. And then I remember we came to Medicine Lodge, probably Anthony, and then south into, I don't remember coming through Newkirk, but we probably
Did you have horses?
We had a team of young mules and a riding horse.
Okay, so the mules pull the wagon.
The mules pulled the wagon.
Tell me, what did you pack in the wagon when you came down?
Just the necessities to live along the highway.
Which was?
Bedding and food and clothing.
And how many
it was in February, so we had to have warm clothing. Well, there was my sister Fern, who was 2 years older than I, and my parents, and the youngest one of the family, which was, she was probably about a year old.
Okay.
And when we came, we stopped really, the first, we stopped in Cross, which is now, of course, a part of Ponca City. And when they found a place to live, my father went back and sent my oldest sister, who had the other, it was a family of 8 children, 1 boy and 7 girls. My oldest sister, and then my brother, and then my sister. I was in the middle. I was the 4th child. And he went back and sent them down by train and brought our possessions, our furniture and the other animals down by boxcar.
I have a question. When you traveled by covered wagon like that, how did you know where you were going?
General direction. They probably had a map. There were
Any roads, were there?
Oh, sure, there were good roads.
There were?
Good mud roads. There weren't any finished roads, but there were roads between town. Of course, I guess they had a general idea where they were going, where they were heading, and go from one town to the other. You know, and the towns weren't very far apart.
How long did the trip take you?
Several weeks. I don't remember just how many weeks.
Where'd you camp? How'd you sleep in the wagon?
Beds. It was a large wagon, and there were 5 of us really. The baby didn't take up much room, and it was big enough that they'd fold the beds up at night and spread them out.
You have an overjet?
On a frame inside the covered wagon.
Did you have an overjet on the wagon?
A what?
An overjet that laid across?
Yes, something. And
I've heard that term used before.
well, I hadn't heard it, but that's what.
Okay. What are some of the stories on the trip that you remember?
Nothing really. The weather, as I remember, was not unpleasant, especially for that time of the year. And I don't remember very much about the trip.
What about fording rivers?
We didn't ford any rivers.
You didn't?
We crossed on bridges, several bridges.
Oh, there are bridges then?
Oh, sure.
Okay. What kind of work your father do?
My father was a cattleman, and he did farming to raise food for cattle.
Okay. Did you farm here?
Yes, out about 10 miles southwest of town.
Okay.
And they just lived here. They lived here until 1911. And then they moved to Osage County over near Pawhuska. And
Did he farm over there also?
he had cattle. I mean, he had the type of cattle. He had cows and calves. He raised them, for the increase. And the farming that he did was to raise food for the cattle.
As a little girl, what chores did you do in the ranch?
I did. My mother was a Scotswoman, and everybody had a chore. Everybody had a chore. My first chores were watching my younger sisters, and then bringing in fuel for the stove, gathering the eggs, and when I was about 6 years old, my brother taught me how to milk a cow. Milk cows, and we milked, of course, a number of cows, and my mother made butter, sold it at the grocery store. So I learned to milk cows. We got up early, about 5 o'clock in the morning, and one of our chores about that same time was to go out and put feed in the boxes, throw down hay to feed the horses and the cattle.
What about doing laundry?
When I was about 12 years old, my mother, who didn't like to do housework, she had a green thumb. She liked to garden, And she also, of course, had to sew for 7 girls, so she had plenty to do. My sister Fern, who was 2 years older than I, took one of the younger sisters. And 1 week, we would do the cooking and the housekeeping. And the other 2, myself and my other sister, we did the laundry and the ironing and that sort of thing. And we changed about week from week to week.
Did you use a sat iron?
One that was heated on top of a wood stove.
How many irons did you have?
3.
3. How much of a shirt or a dress could you iron before you had to get a hot iron?
I don't remember. It didn't take long. You were always changing irons back and forth.
What about starch? How'd you make starch?
Of course, practically all of the girls' clothing was cotton, calico, gingham, chambray, and the pillowcases were all starched. The men's shirts were the sleeves and the front, and the collars were starched.
Did you use commercial starch, or did you make your own?
We made our own.
How'd you make it?
With boiling water and fall starch. We bought the dry starch, but we made our own starch in boiling water.
What about soap?
Well, we bought some soap, and then there was a lot of the soap that was homemade.
How do you make soap?
With lye and grease.
Did you have an ash hopper, or did you buy your lye?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
And I remember that they did in the fall, when they were butchering hogs, and they had a lot of fat. They'd render the fat and use the fat.
Did you ever render lard?
I've seen it done, but I never have done it, other than just in cooking. But they used to, I know that we used to render great big, 5-gallon containers of lard. And it was used until the next butcher.
How much lard can you get out of a good-sized hog?
I don't know. I was too small when that was going on to give any thought to it.
When you lived around Ponca City, what kind of house did you live in?
It took a good-sized house to accommodate a family that size. And the first house we lived in Cross was probably an 8-room house, as I remember.
Was it frame?
Frame. They were all frame houses that we lived in.
Okay. Where did you start school?
I started school in Illinois.
Illinois?
At the age of 4.
At 4?
Mm-hmm.
Why so young?
Well, my sister Fern, who was 2 years older than I, was a very shy child. And of course she started when she was 6. And anytime the teacher spoke to her, she started crying. And so my mother had been a school teacher, and the teacher and she got together, and I was not a shy child. I was a pretty forward sort of brat. And when my mother was trying to help Fern in the evenings, I was standing there looking over their shoulders and taking everything in and remembering what she was trying to teach. So they decided maybe that it was a country school, a one-room school, that if I went, why, I might give Fern courage, so they let me go to school. And so we were in school together, and I was her, I was her backbone as long as, until after we were adults, she leaned on me. And
what about the schools near Ponca City?
Well, I went through the 7th and 8th grades and through high school. I graduated from high school here.
What year?
Do I have to tell that too? You can guess it. Well, I graduated when I was 15, when I was in 1914.
What did you do after high school?
I taught country school for 3 years over in Osage County.
What school?
Well, one of them was north of Pawhuska, about 9 miles, out in a very rugged, rough area of Osage County.
What was the name of the school?
Revard School.
Ever teach any kids there named Fairbanks?
What?
No, not Fairbanks.
Burbank?
Yes, Fairbanks. Fairbanks.
No, Burbank. Are you?
No, did you have any students named Fairbanks in your class?
No.
Okay.
Most of the children, the people that lived in this area, had moved over from southern Missouri, and they were a hillbilly type of people, and they had run the teacher off. Now, by the time I was teaching school, I was 16 years old, my first year, and the teacher before me, they had run her off. The kids were that difficult, evidently. So I knew about that, and there were bets in the area that I wouldn't last the year. So one of the boys, and I had kids in the class in the school that were older than I was, but of course they didn't know that. Well, there was one boy there that was a smart sort of a kid, about 15 or 16 years old, and he was telling me about this other teacher, and he had found the biggest, hardest word in the dictionary and had taken it to her to pronounce. And she said, "Oh, that's a jawbreaker," and she didn't try to pronounce it. Well, 2 or 3 weeks after that, he came. I guess he forgot about this conversation. He brought the dictionary with that jawbreaker to me. Well, I knew he couldn't pronounce it, so I pronounced it for him. And from then on, I had his respect. And I had no trouble with the children in that school. And I kept them there till the last minute of the last hour of the last day of school. And that's the kind of guy I am. So, and the next year I taught out east of Hominy. And then the third year I taught about 9 miles west of Postville on Highway 60.
How many grades did you teach?
To the 8th grade, from kindergarten to the 8th grade.
Was it a one-room school?
One-room school.
How does one teacher teach 8 grades?
Well, you don't have too many children. And the little ones you teach first, and you let them go out ahead of the others out to play if the weather's nice. Or you have something for them to do, drawing or learning to write. But, and you take them, just one after the other, one grade after the other. I think that children learn a lot from hearing the others recite. But it wasn't any problem.
Did you organize any work to help the war effort in World War I?
Yes, I did.
What'd you do?
Well, I sold Liberty bonds, and I went out with speakers and spoke to the citizens.
What'd you speak on?
Oh, patriotic things.
What about Chautauqua?
I went to Chautauqua. Chautauqua was, of course, was very popular at that time, and that was one entertainment that everybody tried to raise enough money to buy a ticket.
Where was it held?
It was held. The Chautauquas that I went to were held in Pawhuska. And up on, are you familiar with Pawhuska?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it was held up on the hill there by the Indian.
Agency Hill?
Agency Hill.
What did you like best about Chautauqua? What section of it?
All of it.
All of it?
All of it. It was entertainment that, that we didn't see very often.
I understand that William Jennings Bryan was a big speaker in Chautauqua.
Well, I don't believe, I ever heard him.
Okay.
But there was music, and there was little plays, and people, speakers, speaking on different subjects.
Now, did they have their own tent they set up, or?
Well, there's a tent. I don't know whether that was their tent or whether it was, I imagine it was their tent because they were a traveling outfit, but I think they must have had their equipment.
How much did the ticket cost to go to Chicago?
Oh, they were $2 or $3. Wasn't much because
Well,
I
money
couldn't
back
have,
then, though.
it couldn't have been much because I couldn't have afforded it.
What was your salary when you were teaching?
Well, $60 the first year, and then $75 the last year.
How many years did you teach?
I taught 3 terms.
Then what did you do?
Sir?
Then what did you do?
I was very fortunate. By that time I had inherited my father's 4 younger daughters, and he and my mother had separated. And I needed a year-round job. So I went into and my brother was working in a drugstore in Alaska. And he heard that they were looking for some extra people in the treasurer's office at the courthouse. They were beginning to collect back taxes on Osage surplus lands, about 4 years, and they needed someone to make up statements and figure 6% interest on these taxes on surplus land. So I went up to the courthouse and into the office, and the treasurer was there. He had his back to the door. He didn't hear me come in. And about the time that I stepped in, he let out a string of words I ever heard in my life before or since. He turned around and saw me, and he was so embarrassed that when he found out what I wanted, he hired me. And I worked like a Turk. I didn't know one piece of land from another, but I always learned quickly. That's one thing. I had a good mind, and I learned quickly. And by the time the day was over, I knew Osage County by township, section, township, and range, and by congressional township, strike X, Keeney, and all the other Big Heart, Hominy, 8 of them. Big Yellow were in this end of it. So that was in June, and hi Frank, come in. So by the 1st of July, you know, the treasurer's office has a fiscal year from July 1 to July 1. He was going out of office, and the county assessor resigned. And the commissioners appointed him county assessor, and he took me along as his deputy. So I worked 2.5 years as his deputy, and he was an outdoors man. He didn't like pencil work. There was an awful lot of that in the county assessor's office. So I worked 2.5 years, and he resigned with a year and 2 months left of his term. So the county commissioners appointed me county assessor. And then I was elected for a term. And I didn't like politics. I didn't like I didn't like...
What year were you elected?
I was elected in 1920.
1920.
I served as assessor 21 and 22. I was appointed in 1919 and served November and December of 1919, and then 1920 as an appointee, and then I was elected for 2 years.
Did you know Fred Lookout?
Yes, when they married. Yeah, and I have a good story about that.
I was going to ask, what kind of man was Mr. Lookout?
He was a very dignified, very very dignified man, and I think a very fine man. He was an excellent chief of the Osages.
What's the story you were going to...
Well, I shouldn't tell it. It's not on him, it's on his wife. But anyway, I'll tell you, after I finished my term of office, I came over and went to work for the Marland Company. That was in January 2, 1923. As I came over to take over their tax work. They didn't have any, they were scattered all over the company. And I was hired to come over and organize the tax department, which I did. But this story about Mary Lookout. There was a house of ill repute in Huska. A woman with 3 daughters, and she was a part Indian. I think she was from over in eastern Oklahoma, the poor Indians. So she had this house of ill repute, trying to find Well, the Osages, for her daughters. Well, two of them married, but the third one was kind of a, I think she wasn't very bright. I think she was awful, and not very good looking either. But anyway, the mama and this girl who was underage entrapped this fellow, Jim Martin, who was a full blood, and they made him marry her. And so he didn't stay with her very long. And one night out at the fairgrounds, they had a, what do you call it, going on, like you have at fairs.
A fair?
No, it wasn't a fair, but the entertainment that you have at fairs. The sideshows and that sort of thing was going on out at the fair, out at the fairgrounds. And I took my younger sisters out, and I was sitting in a car, right, and Mary Lookout was in her car, right, sitting right next to me. And she sat there the whole evening. Well, during this affair, this girl shot at her ex-husband, and he shot her and killed her. And so he was, of course, arrested and tried for murder. And Mary Lookout swore that she saw the shooting, and she was, reputable with being Fred Lookout's wife and having an excellent reputation and all. But the lawyer for the defense, and she claimed that, of course, that the girl shot first, and maybe she did, I don't know, but anyway, there she just sat and lied on it, and I didn't do anything about it, because I thought the girl deserved what she got anyway.
You didn't see it either. You all sit side by side.
How come you came to work for the Marland Oil Company?
Well, of course, I was well known here in Ponca City, and I had a lot of friends who were with Marland. Mr. W.K. Moore, the general counsel, I had lived in their home when I was a senior in high school, and Mrs. Moore's brother, John Alcorn, was in the land department of the Marland Company, and I knew him quite well. I used to press his shirts and his clothes for 25 cents. So when I was looking for a job, and I had an offer from Shell Oil Company in St. Louis, but I didn't want to go that far away from my sisters. And so Mr. Moore called me one day, and he said, I don't do anything until we've talked to you. So in December, they called me over for an interview, and I was called before the executive committee, which was all the heads of the departments, and Mr. Marlon wasn't there, he was out of town. But they cross-examined me and questioned me, and finally Mr. McFadden, he was a great, robust fellow that had a big, deep voice and had a way of trying to frighten people, I think. Did you ever know him, Frank?
Briefly.
So he said...
He was a rough, tough character.
Yeah, he was. But he said, finally he said, young lady, do you think you can handle this job? And I said, no, sir, Mr. McFadden, I don't think I can. I know I can. He said, well, you step outside. About 2 minutes, they called me back, and they said, can you go to work tomorrow? And I said, no, I've got to go home and take care of my affairs. But I came on the 2nd day of January.
Mm-hmm.
What year?
1923.
1920.
How long did you work for Marland?
Well, I worked 36 regular years, and then about 4 years in overtime.
Did you know Mr. Marland?
No, I can't say that I knew Mr. Marland. I knew Mrs. Marland, his first wife, and she was a lovely lady.
I was going to ask, what was she like?
She was a lovely lady, and very friendly and very gracious. And I knew Lydia is about a 13-year-old girl. She was very shy. And I knew George quite well from the time, he was 14, 15 years old. We had our senior class, and I guess our junior class too, we had a little dance club. And George and Bill Beard, who is, used to, he died this last year. He was a country boy, but he was in the Frontier Federal Savings and Loan.
Old Ponca Savings and Loan?
Yeah, the old Ponca Savings and Loan. And they were the only two boys who knew how to dance. And there was one girl who played the piano, so we'd gather there, and George and Bill Beard taught me what little I knew about dancing. And of course, when I came back over to work, George was a very outgoing fellow and very friendly and very pleasant. I know one time I had met my husband, and we were just good friends. And while I was still a county assessor, and I was working this end of the county, and I was staying overnight in Ponca City with my friend the Moores, and he asked me to come down by the office at around 5 o'clock when they quit, so I did. And I walked in this office, all men, and George Marland was one of the fellows he worked in there, and he jumped up and he said, "Hi, you sweetheart." He ran over and he threw his arms around me and kissed me. And that's just how, I think he called me sweetheart because I don't think he remembered my name. But we were always friendly, and I liked George very much.
When was Marlon elected governor? What year?
It was 1933 or 35.
So he was governor after Murray then, Bill Murray.
He's elected 35, 39.
Whatever. When?
He's elected in 35, so from 35 to 39.
Marlon, yeah.
What kind of governor was he?
Well, he was a good governor. He started the tax commission, which was badly needed. I think he made a good governor. He was U.S. Senator before.
He was.
Wasn't he a congressman?
I guess it was congressman instead of Senate, but
He got beaten in the Senate.
yeah, he ran for the Senate and then was defeated.
Didn't he also start the Oklahoma Highway Patrol?
I'm not certain about that.
That was in 36, 37.
Probably. But he did start, I know he did start the tax commission, which was badly needed. Because I know that because I was down before the Board of Equalization there from 1923 on, and I could see a need for someone who really...
So what were your major duties with the company?
Well, I was... after I organized the tax department, then the income tax end of it had been handled in Oklahoma City by a firm of lawyers. So they decided to move it to Ponca, and one of the lawyers in this firm came, Mr. H.L. McCracken. And so they moved Mr. McCracken and me together, and Mr. McCracken was made head of the department naturally, and I was the assistant. And I handled property taxes, all the company's property taxes, the sales taxes, motor fuels, and excise, all the little extras, until the merger with Continental of Maine. And then I took over all the property that Continental of Maine had, and they organized a sales tax department because the Continental of Maine was primarily a marketing department company, and they had lots of marketing property. They had lots of, at that time, the sales tax had gone wild.
I forgot to ask one question. I was going to ask you, what did you do on Armistice Day?
On Armistice Day?
Yeah.
What Armistice Day? The first one?
Yes, ma'am.
I shot off my father's shotgun about midnight when we got the news. I took my father's shotgun, went outdoors and shot it into the air.
What was the general feeling around Conoco when, I guess when the merger came on and Mr. Marlon was
Well, of course, everyone had a great admiration for Mr. Marlon because of his good works. And but it was a time, you know, a bad time, just before the stock market fell. And they had, well, I guess it was after they tried to make him chairman of the board, and he didn't. They knew that was a figurehead, and so he refused that. And then he tried to start another company, but it didn't work. But his employees were very loyal to him. He had been good to them, paid them better wages than the industry paid. And so there was a lot of sorrow about his losing out. And then they brought in Mr. Baird Markham, General Baird Markham, and another an accountant who cut all the dead wood out of the Marland organization. And then they went out to Denver and they did the same thing with the Continental Maine organization. And then they moved quite a number, most of the Continental Maine people down here. And the atmosphere was pretty rugged for a long time before the Denver people and the Ponca City people decided that we were all pretty decent people. Yeah. And I had lots of friends that came from Denver.
You mentioned that Mr. Marland did a lot of good works in Ponca City. What did he do?
Well, the children's, the Masonic, not the Masonic, but the American Legion home out here, he and Mr. McFadden each built one of the original buildings out there. He was instrumental in starting the hospital out on the hill, and he gave to practically every one of the churches here in town to build new modern church buildings. And he was very, very generous with his money. He sent a lot of young Ponca City men to OU to study geology. And I don't know, can you add anything to that, Frank?
Well, that's just about the gist of it. If there was some good to be done around town, as you say, one of the churches needed something for the building fund, he was always available to help out.
He was very generous with his money, too much so.
How did the Depression of the 1930s affect Ponca City?
Well, it affected us less than I think it did other communities, because the company still functioned. They had already had the layoffs with Mr. General Markham having cleaned out, as I said, the dead wood. And while there were no salary increases, and if anyone was hired, they were hired at a very low salary.
This was just about the only city in the country that didn't have some serious...
just really feel.
We were affected less, I think, than anybody else in the world.
Huh. How did World War II affect Conoco?
Well, it made all of us who were working there work harder. So, all I know, of course, a lot of the young men went into the Army, went into the service.
Did you?
They, for instance, in my department, from the time I had assistants, say a stenographer, I always had to have a male stenographer because I was always training someone for bigger and better things. And when the war came along and the young men were going off to war, well then that's the only time during my 36 years that I ever had a woman secretary.
So, did Conoco organize any efforts?
Sir?
Did Conoco organize any work for the war effort? in
I
World War
don't,
II?
I was too busy doing all the things I had to do because I had taken on all this extra work. And I was just too busy that I don't remember what, if anything, they did in the war.
Were there any the big dust storms here like they had out west?
Yes, in 1933 and 34 we had terrible dust storms here.
Describe those dust storms.
Well, they're just so thick that you couldn't see hardly ahead of you. I remember one time in late February, my husband and I had stopped off after work at a movie, and we came out of the movie after we'd seen the picture, and you couldn't see on the street, you couldn't see a block away, the dust was so thick and heavy. And it was very dry, and 1933 and 34 were very bad years, dust-wise.
1936.
Yeah. And 36 was a year when we had extremely hot temperatures here. And drought.
Yeah, April 35, they had what they call a black duster.
Was that out in western?
That was, I'm not sure if it got this far.
I don't believe it did. I don't recall that. In April 35, the thing I remember is the terrific hailstorm we had here. And that ruined half the roofs in town and did a great deal of damage.
1955, I think, in Blackwell.
They had a tornado there.
Did that hit Ponca City also?
No. We haven't had a tornado in Ponca City. The last one that I recall was in 1912.
What happened in that tornado?
Well, of course, the town was small then, and it cleaned. There wasn't much west of the railroad track. There wasn't much development. There was, on the south side of Grand Avenue, there was a farmhouse, and it was a farm and a farmhouse. On the north side, there was development, and what is now the Trout Funeral Home was the Calkins Mansion, and it took the big Grecian pillars that was part of the front entrance of the house. It tore those away, and they found parcels, pieces of them up near Kildare, which was 9 or 10 miles away. And then there was another house, the Wild House. It was a big 2-story house that was, I'm talking about this first tornado.
Yeah.
The Wild House, WYLDE, was a big 2-story house, and it took the roof completely off of that. And it just swept the west side of the railroad tracks, almost bare, except for those 2 houses were left standing. And there was one woman, I think, killed, a grandmother, who stayed. She was minding her grandchildren, and some of the neighbors took them in for safeties. Yeah. And her house was destroyed, and she was killed, as I remember. But after that happened long later, April or early May. But any time a cloud came up, we left school. Whether it was a school, it was. Whether it was a cloud that had any danger in it or not. But the black cloud emptied the school building.
What kind of parties did they have here at the mansion?
What kind of parties?
Yeah.
Oh, with this?
Here
at the big. Well, I didn't go to any of those parties. The only time that I ever went, and I don't think that he had, as governor, he used this, but he didn't live in that mansion very much. He lived in what was called the studio, but he did open the mansion for parties while he was governor, but he didn't do much entertaining in that house.
What about in the cultural center of the White House?
Well, earlier when they lived there, that was a life of fun and gaiety. They had lots of entertainment, lots of parties there. Of course, that was in the early good days when everything was
What did Mrs. Marland die of? Did she have pneumonia or
No, she had, the first Mrs. Marland,
Yeah.
no, she died of cancer.
cancer?
Well, anything else?
No, you know, I guess when he resigned as president of Marland Oil, you know, I read some things to where I guess, you know, they sort of asked him if he'd come, you know, don't travel so much and sort of come back home and tend to business. And then you hear the side that maybe, you know, they just sort of swindled it out of him, you know.
Well, I think the thing that got Mr. Marland in trouble, he was expanding very rapidly from, the early 1920s. He started expanding about 1924, 25, 26. He had the Marland Oil of Texas, he had the Marland Oil of Colorado, he had the He had huge warehouses with millions of dollars of drilling material, pipe and casing and so on, and stockpiles. And he borrowed $20 million from J.P. Morgan and Company. And they didn't like the way he was handling their money. So they got enough men on the board of directors to house him. That's what happened. And it was the $20 million, I think, that he borrowed from them that ruined him. I believe he could have gotten through the crisis if
He had known that, yeah.
But because his California operations were successful and are still going strong, I guess.
How much time did he spend in Europe? Did he spend a lot of time there, or was that just...
I don't know about that. I really don't know. I had a job to do, and it kept me pretty busy, and I had to travel a great deal, and then I was married, and I had a house to run, a husband to keep happy. So.
Well, we appreciate you getting out for us today. As I say, this is going to be on file at the archives at the Historical Society.
Well, my husband worked 37 years for the company.
He did.
Was a World War I veteran.
When did you get married?
1924. Yeah, well, as a young man, he had played professional baseball, but he was a pitcher. He was a left-handed pitcher and a very good one, but he ruined his arm.
Who did he play for?
He started out with Maysville, Kentucky, and then he ended his career, I think, with Columbus, Ohio, but he had been sold to the Cleveland Indians, but he injured his arm, and I never had an opportunity to play.
What was his name?
Joe Russell Vance. And
was he related to Vance?
No.
Vance Air Force?
Probably not closely, but all the Vances are related because they have a common background, all the Vances I ever knew. And I knew the mother of this Vance that the airport was named after, the Air Base was named after. And there were three brothers that came over from Ireland and settled in the colonies and practically all of the Vances I ever ran into had this story in their background. And his ancestry goes back. We had a book showing that his ancestry went back to the 1066 when William the Conqueror. His ancestor was a lieutenant under William the Conqueror, and that they came to England, and then later, a good many years later, they came to Ireland and then to the colonies.
Well, thank you.
You're most welcome.